So we're talking about this nuancing, if you
Yes.
like, of history. And I want to bring that around to know your interest in and your development as a I don't want to call you a gendered historian because I think the introduction of gender to history is a nuancing again, an
Yes,
expansion of history. But what do you think accounts for your being drawn to history, or to the history of women, but also to engendering history?
Right, good. Well, first of all, let me say, and this would be more than obvious to you, that it took a long time before a gender consciousness seeped into my work. You would have seen that in race relations, it's barely there. It may be under the surface, but it is not in any way explicit. And the book, which in fact is even much more widely read than Race Relations, A History of Modern Trinidad, which has sold, I must say, it's the only book I've actually made some money out of.
Oh yes, I forgot that. It's been used as a...
Everywhere. It's used everywhere.
The secondary schools
Secondary
as well.
schools, Costa, UTT, University of the Southern Caribbean, and of course here. I'm almost embarrassed at the almost total absence of gender from that book. Yes, trust me, read it. Okay, so bear in mind I was trained as a historian in the 60s and early 70s. I didn't know what Lucille Mayer was doing in Jamaica, I only learned that later, and gender history, women's history was only coming to the surface, so I was trained in an earlier era. Okay, what introduced me to gender? I was, I'm sure you know, it's part of the legend of the history of this institution. I was one of that very small group of women
in Development
gathered
Studies.
by Marjorie Thorpe, and please put Marjorie Thorpe is the pioneer here on this campus, who was gathered by Marjorie Thorpe to create a little group. I was one of a tiny group. And one of the really important things we did, that little group did, was educate ourselves. That was our first objective before we attempted to educate anyone else in the university community. And we held little seminars and so on. By the early 80s, of course, literature was coming out. Pioneers like Sheila Rowbottom were rewriting British history, European history, American history. Lucille's work was unpublished, but I did read it because we had a copy of the thesis. We've always had a copy here. So by the 80s, partly because I was part of Marjorie's group and partly because literature was now coming out, I began to absorb it. I was one of the key teachers and designers of our famous AR 301, another legendary, the legendary course that we team taught.
Women and History
It was called Introduction to Women's something or other. Women's Studies, I think. History was about a 6 to 8 week component, which I did. Marjorie did literature. We had Gwendolyn Williams, I think, did sociology, and there were perhaps, was Rhoda, I can't remember if Rhoda was at St. Augustine at that period. So I would say by the late 80s, gender and some of the literature was part of my consciousness. In the early 90s, if I had to give a date, it would be 92. I designed and taught the course, which is still taught, Women and Gender in the History of the Caribbean. I taught it here, Vereen Shepherd taught it at Mona. Various people began to teach it at Cave Hill. So you could say then in the course of the 80s and moving into the early 90s, what I came to recognize was that my early fascination with class and race and how they intersected had been missing a crucial analytical component. And so I recognized that gender, not always as obviously critical as ethnicity and class, not always, sometimes, but I came to realize it was the third leg of the trinity of analytical tools that we have to use when we are trying to understand social history. So I would like to hope that my work since about 1990 has had a clear gender perspective, but I will admit freely that the earlier work hardly did.
I know you've been saying that gender consciousness took a while to seep in. But I think there's something about gender consciousness that eludes people for their entire lifetime because it isn't part of their makeup.
Okay, got you.
And when you started telling me from the beginning about your life, first of all, 2 points occurs to me. One, that you have a life that is in constant, you had a childhood, if you like, in constant movement and shifting.
True.
So you're constantly getting used to change and adapting to that change, if you like. Perhaps finding solace in books.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
at the same time, having to adjust.
Yeah.
Secondly, the women in your life, for instance, your mother, the death of your mother, even though you were young, would have had some kind. You have lost what other people, most people naturally grew up with. Your grandmother is a strong figure. Your sister is a strong figure.
Absolutely.
Your stepmother as, not the Cinderella stepmother, but certainly, a stepmother who you have to get adjusted
Absolutely.
to. A close relationship with your father so that you have a fundamental respect for masculinity.
Yes.
When you talk about Elsa Govaya, you talk about Elsa Govaya glowingly, but you also talk about the importance of Douglas Hall and Donald Wood in your life. Then you talk about coming to Trinidad and having to adjust again.
As a wife.
So there's a way in which, as a person, and this might come from literature, literature does deal with gender in many ways, that subliminally comes into our consciousness. So there's something about the way in which you speak that I see gender as being...
Yes. I think you put that beautifully. And let me say that when I was growing up, and remember I'm growing up in the 50s and the early 60s, I never had a sense that I wouldn't have a life of my own. I never had that sense. I had a very academic education. It was taken for granted I would go to university. Before the Jamaica thing came up, because I was bright in sixth form, it was taken for granted I would have followed the footsteps of both my brother and my sister, who both won scholarships to Cambridge and so on. So I was destined for Oxford or Cambridge. And I took it for granted that, I don't want to say that I would have a career, because I don't know if we thought about it in those days, but that my life would be more than that of a wife and a mother. Although, like everybody else, I thought I probably would get married and so on. So that was part of it. My granny's influence was that of a loving, nurturing person. She never worked outside the home in her whole life, and she never earned any money in her whole life, but she was a strong person in her own way, and my stepmother most definitely, a cultured, strong person. So I guess gender was there, and Rachel's influence was very strong. Rachel knew from early she wanted to be a scientist. She was much more focused than I was in that point of view, and she has lived in Australia for most of her professional life, and she has retired as a very well-known entomologist. She's big in the entomology world, I can assure you. So yes, I agree with you. That was in our head. When I was at Mona as an undergraduate, although anti-feminist ideas were still very much around in the early 60s, I think they were beginning to they were being challenged, of course. So let me say that I never doubted that I would have a life which was more than being a wife and a mother, and I never doubted that I would be able to use the intellectual gifts and the excellent education which I'd got first in Exeter and in Mona. So I sort of fell into the academic life, partly my father's example, partly I did a PhD here. It was considered a good PhD, and I sort of fell into the academic life here. Yes, so gender, I think, was probably there. I think I was lucky in when I was born, in the 20th century, when you think about it. I often think about this. Women born much earlier in the 20th century, their life chances were so much more limited, But I was born, just about at the right time.
Yeah, I think the gains of Mary Wollstonecraft weren't really met until the 20th century.
I think that's absolutely true.
Post-suffragettes.
Absolutely true. When I was at my grammar school, it was still, it wasn't the law, as far as I know, but there was a very strong convention that women teachers resign, not necessarily on marriage, but on first pregnancy.
Right.
And I distinctly remember that happening with two of my beloved teachers. They got married. They continued to teach for a bit after their marriage, but as soon as they had their first pregnancy, they resigned. Now, I don't think that was the law. I'm sure it wasn't. But it was just the understanding, the unspoken understanding in the late 50s and very early 60s. If you're having a baby, you should be home. And also, I think there was a feeling that a pregnant woman shouldn't be on display in public teaching, even in an all-girls school, and mine was an all-girls school. So they were those teachers of mine were obviously born maybe 20 years earlier than me.
Do you remember your emotion when they were told, when they had to leave?
I didn't think about the pregnancy bit. I'm not even sure if we were told that. We just knew that I remember her name to this day, Mrs. Claiborne, had left. And of course, subsequently we learned she had a baby. I remember missing her desperately. But it didn't strike me at that point that it was unfair that she had to. It was a fact. It was a fact of life. You know.
Okay, I think this would be a very fruitful discussion to pull you out more on, because I think there's more that is resident there. Than,
I'm sure there is.
So this is to be continued at some point. But I wanted to move into just two areas that I think to just have in this particular interview that we need to do. And one is that you were at one point in the history of this university, you had become the first female deputy principal.
The first at St. Augustine.
At St.
Marlene
Augustine.
Hamilton had been deputy principal at Mona earlier.
No, but at St. Augustine in particular, you're the first female. And then for a short while, I know acting.
I had two short stints.
Right.
Between Bourne and Tiwari, and then between Tiwari and Sanka. So in all, I acted as principal for about a year in two stints.
Right. Any comments on your selection for that period?
Compton Bourne was the one who chose me as deputy principal. It astonished me at the time because I had never been dean. And I think the expectation was that it would be a dean or a former dean who would be chosen as deputy principal. I have never served as dean. I had been head of department for many years, and I think I was quite a good head of department. It did surprise me. My gender may have had something to do with it. All Compton told me was that I was widely respected, and he thought my appointment as deputy principal would be met with some positive reaction. I thought hard about accepting it. I mean, I had the reluctance that any academic, I think, has, but I was persuaded that I ought to take it. It was a very interesting experience, because you have been in a similar kind of position. What it did is force me to learn very quickly about the campus as a whole and the university as a whole, whereas previously I'd been only too happy to only really inform myself about my department and maybe my faculty at a stretch, and that was it. It was very interesting, and some of the assignments that Compton gave me were extremely interesting. I did miss being a full-time academic. I got on very well with Compton. We worked well together. But I did eventually, by the way, I voluntarily exited as deputy principal. People think I was fired. I was not. I voluntarily exited. There had been a change of principal, and I thought that was a good time to exit. I mean, I did 1 year as deputy principal under the new principal, Bo Tiwari, but then I thought it was only fair to him that he should be able to choose. Yes, I was not his choice, and also I wanted to get back into academic life. The two stints as acting principal, the most stressful was the more recent one between Tiwari and Sankat. There were a lot of crises going on the campus at that time. And it wasn't clear to me how far as an interim person I should move. So that was a stressful period. But I mean, I'm not sorry that it happened. It happened. I think I learned a lot from it. Obviously, you lose time which otherwise could have been used both for teaching and for writing and so on. But all in all, perhaps it wasn't such a bad thing. And I accept the point that so many people told me it is important in the cause of gender that there should be visible women at the top of the administrative hierarchy.
I think, if I may, more than your gender, I think what Compton's choice was based on was, in fact, my own assessment, because I know we've had a close relationship. You were one of my supervisors for my PhD.
Yes,
and
I read every word of several drafts. I do remember that.
And you were also when we had the inaugural seminar.
Yes, I remember.
You would have been in fact, you were the leading person on this campus in gender and history there, in women's
I
history.
Was, yes, I
so your paper became
again
classic in that.
I remember that.
But I think it is also going back to your race relations book. It's maybe that capacity to be fair and even-tempered in dealing with matters, which, from my own stint in administration,
it's important.
Really one of
I'm
the
sure
best,
that was a factor.
Best qualities, if you like, to bring to any.
I agree.
Thing. Slightly different question, but one that I wanted to ask you is, of all the work, of the books that you've been involved in, whether self-authoring or involved with other projects and editing and so on, there are two parts to this question really. Which of these do you like the best and why? Maybe I'll leave it there and then come back to the second part of the question so I don't confuse
me. All right, good. Well, as you have said, Race Relations, I think, is intellectually my most influential book. And I do think, and it sounds immodest, I know, I do think it stood up well to the test of time and so on. In terms of readership, A History of Modern Trinidad is by far the most widely read because it has been read by so many young people, sixth formers and university students across the country and elsewhere too. But the book I am most proud of, it's the one that very few people have ever read. It's my biography of Sir John Gorrie, Law, Justice and Empire. I'm very proud of that book because I think it really is a triumph of historical research. Because that man served all over the colonial empire, I had to research documentary sources, primary sources, from Scotland, England, Jamaica, Mauritius, Fiji, the Western Pacific, the Leeward Islands, and Trinidad and Tobago. So in terms of empirical archival research, I think that book clearly represented the most work. I think the narrative and the analysis is really very good. And it's interesting because it didn't make any great impression when it first came out. But interestingly, in recent years, it has actually been read because there is a whole new interest in law and empire. The role of law, the role of judges, the role of magistrates, the role of scholars of jurisprudence in the empire. There's a whole new movement. And because this is one of the very few scholarly biographies of a colonial judge who moved around, it's actually come into prominence. It got me a trip to Singapore last year when I was invited to present a paper on Gorrie to the first conference on law and empire and the British Empire. This is going to be the first of successive conferences. So I think as a professional historian, I'm proudest of my Gorrie book. But I have to say, Race Relations and History of Modern Trinidad are my most influential books, I would say.
If you had to think, maybe, I know you will continue to write many books.
I don't know about many books, but I am writing.
You will continue to write.
I am writing.
But if you had to, at this point, kind of assess what you think your major contributions to Caribbean historiography have been, what would you say?
And answering that question, by definition, sounds immodest, but nevertheless, I'll give it a shot.
Be.
Right. Well, first of all, I think I have contributed to the general historiography of Trinidad and Tobago through Race Relations and through A History of Modern Trinidad, through many articles and chapters, and through the series you mentioned with Warner Arundel, which is one of a 3-volume series on early Trinidadian literature. Second, I think I've contributed more generally to the historiography of the social history of the Caribbean after slavery, that critical period 1830s to 1930s. I've written quite extensively Caribbean-wide, well, let me be careful, English-speaking Caribbean-wide on that period. Thirdly, and this is my more recent interest, is in historiography and the way Caribbean history has been imagined and written, and particularly the whole notion of competing, the postmodern notion of competing narratives and how narratives are constructed, how they are challenged, how they're contested, how they're changed. This has been my main interest for the last, 5 or 6 or more years, and I'm writing on that. So I would say those are the 3 main areas that I've tried to contribute to.
Thank you, Bridget. Is there anything that you wanted to, coming out of this interview, that you felt you wanted to end?
Just to say that one wonderful thing that has happened within the university over the last 20 years has really been the flowering of gender studies. I think in my discipline, we now have a rich, rich literature coming both from UE scholars and, of course, from many, many scholars all over the world. So this has been a flowering that was almost unimaginable. You mentioned that Mount St. Benedict seminar. That was about 1986. The literature that I could have drawn on then was so incredibly limited compared with what we have now. And I think UE and the Institute has made a huge contribution to that. So, I think that's something that is really very delightful. The other thing is, it's so good that the discipline of history generally has had this move to social history and cultural history. I think that suits me down to the ground. I'm not knocking the older kinds of history. They will always be critically important. But I think the fact that the discipline worldwide has come to recognize the importance of the softer types of history and the types of history that merge into cultural studies and literary studies and all the rest of it. To me, that's very gratifying, and I'm very glad that I lived in an era where I could be part of all that.
And I just remembered one last thing. You
Sure.
recently completed a history of the University of the West Indies
I
at St. Augustine as well, which has also brought you, which also makes a statement in terms of not just your own, scope of history, but the fact that you've become very much part of the
institution.
Right.
Absolutely.
And your contribution to the university itself and university life.
Absolutely. The principal tells me I'm the official historian of St. Augustine. He doesn't pay me for it, but he tells me so. So I'm proud of that book. I'm glad we did it. We did it, as you know, for the 50th anniversary. And I'm also proud, by the way, of the historical signage. The historical signs, I hope you've noticed them. They're all over campus. You're looking at me as if you haven't noticed them. Well, please check. There are about 10 of them.
Okay.
For example, one's in front of the Dagger Auditorium. One's at the entrance to the principal's house. These are beautifully designed.
Yes, I remember.
Right. Well, I wrote the text, and it was my idea to have historical signage for the 50th anniversary. So, yes, I think institutional history is very important.
Yeah. Well, I was at Emory University, and one of the things I noticed, not only there but other universities, they do benches.
Yes.
And I like that
Dedicated
idea
to individuals?
Right.
Yes, that is a very, very nice idea.
Because when you're around a faculty and you see the bench that relates to the people from that faculty,
absolutely,
it kind of keeps it alive. So on that
good note to end. Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat.